Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of Temple Beth Shalom, I'm pleased to welcome all of you to another terrific evening with this year's Scholar in Residence, Dr. Stephen Berk, who's here backed by popular demand. The topic of tonight's presentation is the Middle East in turmoil, and sadly it is. Dr. Berk is the former chair of the Department of History, director of the program in Russia and Eastern European Studies, and he helps advise the Hillel organization at Union College. We've learned firsthand that Professor Berk is an absolutely superb lecturer and teacher. His lectures are outstanding, and he's in high demand as a guest speaker. He's always informative, interesting, and entertaining, and he's widely known for his expertise on the Holocaust, Russia, the Middle East, and a variety of Jewish topics. Tonight's lecture has been made possible through a generous grant from the Jewish Federation of Sarasota, Manatee. And without any further ado, I present to you Dr. Berk.
Thank you, Al, and thanks to all of you for clicking in. The original title of my talk was to be The Middle Eastern Crisis. And I was supposed to talk about a number of things. I would talk about Iran, I would talk about Turkey, talk about Egypt, but I'm not going to do that tonight. The real title of the talk should be Israel in Crisis. So let me begin, and you're not going to believe how I am going to begin. I'm going to quote a papal encyclical from the second half of the 1930s, an encyclical by Pope Pius XI. Every papal encyclical is known by its first three words. And the first three words of that encyclical were in German. For those of you who are fluent German speakers, you can correct my pronunciation. Mit brennender Sorge, the Pope said, with burning sorrow. And then he went on to condemn Nazi racism. And I'm saying to you, with brennender Sorge, I am filled with cares and sorrow about the state of Israel. Israel is once again in a state of siege. The sources, the immediate sources of the conflict, of course, pivot around the city of Jerusalem. And I think there is a compendium of, let us say, reasons for the conflict in Jerusalem. Number one, provocative acts both by Jews and Arabs against each other. Also, clumsy police tactics by the Israeli police in Jerusalem. But more than anything else, statements by Mahmoud Abbas, the president of the Palestine Authority, telling the people of Jerusalem that the beloved Al-Aqsa Mosque on the Temple Mount, it's in danger. The Israelis want to destroy it. Now, that's a long-standing claim by Arab leaders. The fact of the matter is, no Israeli government has ever talked about demolishing the mosques, the Dome of the Rock or the Al-Aqsa Mosque on the Temple Mount. Yes, there are extremist Israelis, a few of them, who talk about tearing down all these mosques and building the third temple. They are considered by the Israeli government, by the overwhelming majority of Israelis, they are considered to be lunatics, fruitcakes. The idea that the Israelis are really going to demolish the mosques on top of the Temple Mount, that's a fabrication used by Arab leaders going back to the 1920s in order to advance their interests and to stir the mobs up against the Jews. The escalation took place, of course, about 2 days ago when Hamas fired rockets into Israel. This is an important thing that some people don't remember. Sometimes you read in the newspapers, it's as if, well, one side started, the other side, they all came back and forth, that it's not clear as to who started the rocket attack, who started the attacks. The fact of the matter is, and this is an incontrovertible fact, it is Hamas from the Gaza Strip that launched rockets against the state of Israel. The reasons for this are essentially political. Hamas has a problem in the Gaza Strip. The problem is that a growing number of people in Gaza, Palestinians in Gaza, are getting upset with Hamas. It's strict Islamic regulations. It's the shortages, the unemployment. Again, Hamas is in a certain amount of trouble here. And more significant than that is the idea or the desire of Hamas to reestablish its credibility among Palestinians on the West Bank. That is, by shooting rockets into Israel, Hamas can deflect animosity away from itself in the Gaza Strip and can enjoy a good deal of popularity among Palestinians. Please remember, there was an election that was scheduled. There were two elections, one in Israel, of course, and an election among the Palestinians. Hamas was running its candidates against Mahmoud Abbas. Again, I mentioned to him before, the president of the Palestinian Authority. Abbas canceled it, probably because he thought he would lose against Hamas. But now Hamas, to make sure that if elections are going to be held, Hamas now can parade itself the only Arab organization that has the nerve, forgive my crudeness, that has the balls to take on the Israelis. That is what Hamas is doing, is a political act to design, to enhance its image among the Palestinians and to make sure that any international involvement has to factor in Hamas. Hamas wants once again to be a player in the Middle East. This is the way it becomes a player. Now, after saying this to you, I must tell you that in this conflict, the Israelis are at a terrible disadvantage. I don't think you would object when I say to you, this is a political and propaganda news disaster for the state of Israel. The reason for that, I think, I'm sure I'm telling you what you know, but just in case you don't, or it's really in the back of your minds. Hamas fires indiscriminately against Israeli civilian targets. Hamas doesn't give a damn about, let us say, who is hurt or who is killed. And Hamas stations its rockets and its rocket launchers and the people who launch the rockets in schools in Gaza, in mosques in Gaza, and in apartment houses. When the Israelis respond, as they must respond, let me make it clear here to you, there's no government in the world that would have acted differently than the Israeli government. Any government, every government on this planet would have to defend its citizens against rocket attacks. Let me tell you, I'll give you the implausible, the hypothetical, which of course, God willing, will never take place. You can bet your last buck, if rockets were flying on the United States from either Canada or from Mexico, the American response would be even tougher than the Israeli response. So what the Israelis are doing is really a natural and inevitable response. But to use the elegant language, really, it's elegant, but it really is not a good piece of language, is there will be always collateral damage. If Hamas stations rockets and rocket launches and shoots the rockets from places where there are civilians, if Hamas, as it does, hides behind civilians and the Israelis respond, there are Arab civilians in Gaza that are going to die. You don't have to be a great chocham to figure that out. I'm not being condescending here. Some people in the press don't believe that. But the fact of the matter is that's what's going to happen. And unfortunately, it doesn't make a damn bit of difference. It really doesn't make any difference whatsoever that the Israelis warn people about attacks that are coming. They drop leaflets. They make telephone calls to people in apartment houses, telling them that they ought to leave the apartment house. Again, it weakens the Israeli attack, and a lot of people, a lot of the bad guys are able to escape. But the Israelis are moving heaven and earth, for want of a better cliche, are moving heaven and earth to avoid Arab casualties. But those casualties are going to take place, they have taken place, and they will continue to take place. It is again a disaster, a public relations disaster for the state of Israel. But again, I'm telling you, no government in the world would have acted any differently than did the state of Israel. Examples of what happens in the press, really demonstrating the bias of the press, or let us say, the lack of knowledge of the press, can be seen in a number of places. I read a number of newspapers today. I usually read 7 or 8 a day, both foreign newspapers, Israeli newspapers, and American newspapers. There's a long AP story today. It appeared in my local newspaper, but I'm sure it appeared in Florida newspapers as well, describing the battle. It's only, again, there's talk about it, the rockets falling on Israel, the Israelis responding, talk about casualties. Only in the middle of a long article is it mentioned that it is Hamas that began the attack on Israel. Only then it is mentioned. And then I go to that newspaper that I have read since I've been a child, that many of you have read, and that is the New York Times. The lead article in the New York Times today, it is the article on the extreme right side of the New York Times. Long article that goes into what is happening in this conflict between Israel and Hamas. And how does the lesser headline, there's a headline, of course, fighting escalates, and then there's a lesser headline implying that the Israeli Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, has escalated the attack upon the Palestinians, upon, let us say, Hamas, because he wants to guarantee that he will be the next prime minister of the state of Israel. As everyone knows, the Israeli political scene is in flux. President Rivlin had asked Netanyahu to form a government. He could not form a government. Then the president turned to the leader of the opposition, Yair Lapid, and Lapid is also not trying to get a coalition government. And the Times is implying that all of this is taking place, or a good part of it is taking place. The escalation, the Israeli bombs, are to show that Netanyahu is a macho man to the Israeli public. That is absolute nonsense. For the third time, any Israeli prime minister would have acted as Netanyahu. And proof of that is standing next to Netanyahu, supporting the Israeli policy, and probably the architect of the Israeli policy is the Israeli defense minister, Benny Gantz, a former general. And Gantz is one of the primary opponents of Netanyahu. And Gantz says he wants Netanyahu, he had said before the election, he wants Netanyahu to be removed. So the idea that Netanyahu is using this for political reasons is, to use the old language, it's Narishkeit, it's foolishness. Hamas is using it for political reasons. Abbas is inflaming the Palestinians in Jerusalem for political reasons. This is not to say that Netanyahu is without flaws. This is not to say that he's a Vestal virgin. He is not. He is a very, very slippery man, and many Israelis will really oppose him, although he still retains considerable support in the state of Israel. I am only addressing myself to the charge that Netanyahu is fanning the flames in order to enhance his position. That is not correct. And then I go on to see other parts of the New York Times article. Again, a very, very interesting article. We hear from the New York Times reporter, interviewed a number of Palestinians in the Gaza Strip who unfortunately had lost members of their families to the Israeli attack. Now, the stories or the things what they are saying are heartrending. Some have lost a mother, some have lost a father. Children have been killed. There is no interview in that Times article with Israelis, the families of Israelis who have been killed, or the families of Israelis who have been wounded. No interview there whatsoever. That's significant here. That's a bias. And then there's a related article, a very interesting article talking about the conflict. And once again, the Times very cleverly, and I think deliberately, is going to interview certain people. So who do we get? We get Martin Indyk, a former ambassador, American ambassador to the State of Israel, who for years has been very critical of Israel. And sure enough, he's critical now. And then we have a man who represents an organization, J Street, which is always quick off the mark to criticize Israel. One of these things that you can take to the bank. If Israel is perceived to do something wrong, J Street is the first to demonstrate that it is behind those who criticize Israel, but also always parading the fact that Jerry Ben-Ami is an Israeli and that it's an organization composed primarily, not exclusively, of Jews. But what has Jeremy Ben-Ami said? What J Street always says, criticizing the state of Israel. And then there is the Democratic senator from Maryland, Chris Van Hollen, who was quick off the mark again to criticize the state of Israel. We live in a free country, my friends. We really do. Thank God for that. We live in a marketplace of ideas. These organizations and these people have all the right to say in the world. But a paper that purports to be objective, to speak about or to relate both sides of an issue, where in this article are the people from AIPAC, the foremost proponent and defender of the state of Israel? Why isn't someone from AIPAC interviewed? And where is the Senate Majority Leader, Chuck Schumer, the senator from New York State, who for his entire career has been a strong defender of Israel? Why isn't he interviewed? These are questions. Let me say to you, here I'm showing you my own biases, my friends. The New York Times, put it another way, be wary of the New York Times. I've read it since I was a child. And in fact, I have a debt I have to pay to the New York Times. When I was at Madison High School in Brooklyn, and I received a New York State scholarship, not because I was so brilliant, but because about a week before the examination for the New York State Region Scholarship, the New York Times had a whole special section on the history of the state of New York. And sure enough, there were questions dealing with the history of the state of New York on the Region's exam, and I knew them all. I must tell you, I shouldn't tell you this, I'll never tell my students, I also won the scholarship because I read every classic comic that there was. So I knew all the questions of literature. I knew all the protagonists, all the antagonists. I also knew the themes. The point is, the Times of today, well, I would like to say it's not the Times of yesterday, but there's another problem here. The Times of yesterday was not a particularly good newspaper. I'll put it to you in the following fashion. On two of the most important stories of the 20th century, the New York Times was out to lunch. One is the collectivization in the Soviet Union, in which over 5 million people were killed, and the purges that were conducted by Stalin in the second half of the 1930s. The New York Times Soviet correspondent was a man by the name of Walter Duranty. He covered up and lied and apologized for all of the Stalinist crimes. He would win a Pulitzer Prize for that. This important story, in which millions of people were killed, was distorted by the New York Times. And then, as every student of the Holocaust knows, the New York Times put the coverage of the Holocaust in the back pages. So be wary of the New York Times. It is a sophisticated tabloid, that's all it is. There's only one Torah, and that Torah is on your behemoth. And I'm not speaking to you as a religious fanatic. There's only one Torah, and that Torah is not the New York Times. So, my friends, I'm going to continue, but also end where I began. In the final analysis, for want of a better cliche, the background for everything that I have said to you is a struggle over what the Palestinians refer to as Philistine and what Jews refer to as Eretz Yisrael. Whose land is this? Does it belong to the Arabs or does it belong to the Jews? The great strength of the Zionist movement was that it took the middle road, saying that this is a land that should be shared, or to use the language of the 1930s and 40s and 50s, this is a land that should be partitioned between Jews and Arabs. In other words, the Zionist movement was prepared to take half of a loaf of bread. There were, to be sure, for those of you who know your Zionist history, there were people like Menachem Begin and a number of other people, Jabotinsky, for example, who said it's all ours. It should be a Jewish state on both sides of the Jordan, not only the West Bank, but the East Bank as well. But the mainstream of Zionism, the overwhelming majority of people in Palestine and outside of Palestine who supported the creation of a Jewish state, said that that Jewish state should not encompass all of Palestine, that should be one state for the Arabs and one state for the Jews. The problem is on the other side. And don't make any mistake about that. What Arthur Rupin, a prominent Zionist leader, said in 1931 is the same thing. He said it in German. Moshe Dayan said it in Hebrew in 1968. I'm saying it to you in English in 2021. It's the same statement in 3 different languages. It runs something like this. What we can get from the Arabs, we do not need. What we need from the Arabs, we cannot get. In other words, historically, the leadership of the Arab community within Palestine and a good part of the Islamic world was not willing to accept even a small Jewish state in a truncated part of Palestine. I will say that again. That is, for Hamas, it makes no difference. There should be no illusions here. This is the root of the conflict. If Israel were to withdraw from every settlement on the West Bank, from every settlement, including Malayadumim, including Efrat, all of those large settlements on the West Bank, if Israel withdrew the 500,000 Israelis who have settled on the West Bank, to Hamas and Islamic Jihad, it would make no difference whatsoever. About almost 20 years ago, a reporter from the New York Times went to interview Sheikh Yassin, the founder of Hamas. And the reporter asked the Sheikh, if Israel withdrew from the Gaza Strip, at that time Israel was still had settlements in the Gaza Strip. If Israel withdrew from every settlement in the Gaza Strip, if Israel withdrew from every settlement in the West Bank, would you then be prepared to make peace with Israel? And the reporter noted that the Sheikh was blind, but his supporters, his advisors, the people who were around him, his confidants, looked at the Times reporter with disbelief. It became very clear to the reporter, the issue is not Israeli settlements. The issue was the existence of the state of Israel. If you want to know why there's no settlement of the conflict, if you want to know why it goes on year after year after year, this is a fundamental reason. There's another reason for it. People don't like to talk about it. There's a religious dimension to the conflict, a very significant religious dimension. Again, people don't like to talk about religious antagonisms, religious, let's say, conflicts. In the eyes of Islam, Jews are dhimmis. That's Dhimmi. A dhimmi is literally a protected person. In the eyes of Islam, this goes back to the foundations of Islam under Muhammad. In the eyes of Islam, Judaism is a legitimate but inferior religion. Why is it inferior? Well, there are certain things in the Torah that the Muslims say contradict monotheism. In a question and answer period, we can go over that. Again, in addition to that, there is the belief, again, that Muhammad, in the eyes of Muslims, is the last and the greatest of the prophets. Remember, the Jewish tradition says that prophecy ended in the 5th century before the Common Era. The last of the prophets is Malachi. And after that, the tradition says there were no further prophets. Muhammad has turned to the Jews, says, look what I've done for you. I am as monotheistic as you are, probably more. And I have talked about Allah, the one God, a God that rewards and a God that punishes. Why don't you come over to me? Most Jews, but not all Jews in the Arabian Peninsula, rejected Muhammad and his new religion of Islam. Muhammad would turn with vituperation against the Jews. But the most important point is, in the eyes of Islam, it is inconceivable that a dhimmi people could exercise sovereignty over land, Jerusalem, that is holy to Muslims. So what have I told you? The sources, the really underlying sources, have nothing to do with a real estate dispute in Jerusalem. Yes, that exacerbated the situation, that initiated the difficulty. The legalities of that are very complex. I am not an attorney. This is a matter for the Israeli Supreme Court to decide. But the underlying issue is, again, do the Jews have a right to settle in that land? And for Hamas and Islamic Jihad, the answer is no. They don't have a right to a single inch. In some ways, for those of you who like historical analogies, it is somewhat similar. All analogies are flawed. So is the one I'm going to give you. The analogy is with the attitude of the Roman Catholic Church towards Zionism, towards the state of Israel. Theodor Herzl, the founder of modern political Zionism, went to see the Pope in the early years of the 20th century. And the Pope expressed sympathy for Zionism. The Pope said, we know how much the Jews have suffered. And then he said to Herzl, I cannot endorse your Zionist idea for a Jewish state in Israel, a Jewish state in Palestine. You know why? The Pope said to him, your people killed Jesus. Are we to give you the control of the holy places of Christendom? To you, the perpetrators of the greatest crime that has ever taken place on this planet? The answer is no. And that's why it's not until the second half, well into the second half of the 20th century, that the Catholic Church and the Pope recognized the existence of the state of Israel. What I'm telling you is that Islam has a problem with Jews and Judaism, legitimate but inferior. The idea that a Jewish state should control the old city of Jerusalem, the Temple Mount, inconceivable in the eyes of large numbers of people, large numbers of Muslims. So where are we now? We are at a place, we're in an unending war, a war that has gone over for a century. And I must tell you again, with brennende Sorge, with burning sorrow, if there will be a truce, and there will be a truce, there will be a truce. There's always a truce, but that's just what it is. It's a truce. This war will go on and on and on in one fashion or another. There will be quiet times and there will be times of war. There will be a peace or truce agreement after this. But until the Arabs, until the leaders of the Palestinian Arab community, until Hamas changes its point of view, believes that the Jewish people have a right to a sovereign state in even a small part of Palestine, this will go on and on and on. Will I say to you that there'll never be peace? People I know, my wife says there'll never be peace. A number of very scholarly people say there'll never be peace. I'm a historian. I'm not a prophet. I'm lucky if I get the past right. To make prophecies, I cannot tell you. What I will say to you, though, is look at what you and I have lived through in the 20th century. Again, my training is in Soviet history. When I spoke to you during the wintertime, and we discussed Putin, discussed a number of things, I said to you, and I'll say it to you again, nobody in the field of Soviet studies predicted the destruction of the Soviet Union. Nobody. Not at Harvard, not at Princeton, and not at Yale, not at the Potted Ivies, Amherst, Williams, and Wesley, and all. Nobody. Nobody at Stanford. Nobody at the University of Chicago. Nobody at Duke. Nobody. All of these chochams, including myself, for example, and I'm not such a great chochem. Nobody predicted what would happen beginning in March of 1985 when Gorbachev came to power. There's a lesson there about personality in history and, of course, what can take place unexpectedly. And then remember what happened in South Africa. 1975, Time magazine publishes an article and it interviews, among others, a group of Afrikaners. And one of the Afrikaners is asked by the Time magazine correspondent, What will you do if the blacks rise? And you know what the Afrikaner said? We will ride till our stirrups are filled with blood. We won't give them, and we'll fight them to the death. And then Nelson Mandela appears, and apartheid goes into the garbage can of history. Do you know what I'm trying to say to you? I believe it will go on for some time. Is this an irreconcilable conflict? I can't say that. What I can tell you, what the historian would say, the political scientist might not say it. Not that the historian is brighter than the political scientist, not brighter than the sociologist, not brighter than the philosopher. But one of the lessons of history is you never, never say never. You don't do it. So, my friends, let me say this to you. In conclusion, if you are a supporter of Israel, think of Israel tonight. Think long and hard about Israel. If you have a son or a daughter or grandchildren in Israel, you pray for them tonight, because they're going to need all the prayers that they can get. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Dr. Berk, for another amazing presentation, as always. I'm going to open this up to Q&A. Well, let me just switch the view back to gallery so I can see all of you. And I don't have, there is a, well, let me see. It's actually more of a comment than a question. This is in the chat. Early in your presentation, you used the term, quote, a public relations disaster for Israel, unquote. Every conflict involving Israel is a public relations disaster for Israel. What can Israel do to change that model?
All right. First of all, I must say to you, if we're talking about the last 30 or 40 years, the comment is a correct one. It's always a disaster for Israel. In an earlier period of time, that was not the case. It really changes in the aftermath of the Six-Day War. Up until the Six-Day War, Israel is portrayed in the American press as an isolated, small, underdog country, the David fighting Goliath. After the Israeli victory in the Six-Day War, Israel is now a titan, a behemoth. Israel is invincible, and Israel is lording it over the other Arabs or other Arabs in the Middle East. Now, what can you do about that? You are right. Certainly for the last 40 years, Israel is portrayed, it's a disaster, a public relations disaster of Israel. We live in a marketplace of ideas, you and I. You can't force people, you can't force them to believe as you do. In a marketplace of ideas, you get out there and you make your case. You make it civilly and you make it rationally. You want to throw in a little emotion, you do that. But civilly and rationally. The cause of Israel is a just cause. There's no need to lie about it. No need to fabricate things. But in a marketplace of ideas, that's the best that you can do. I wish I could tell you more. Or to use the Israeli expression, what I'm telling you here is, I'll use the Hebrew word. Every supporter of the state of Israel, be he or she a Jew or a non-Jew, must be what in Hebrew would be called a shaliach, an emissary of the state of Israel. Whether it's in the media, at the highest levels of politics, or in discussions in your homes or discussion in the streets, one must present and defend the state of Israel. Is Israel without flaws? The answer, no country is without flaws. As you are, we are all students of American history. We know the deficiencies. We know the flaws and the mistakes that were made in American history. And some of them are very tragic. And some of the consequences of those mistakes we live with today and will live with for a long time to come. It's always a question of balance. What were the deficiencies of the countries? What were its liabilities? And what were its assets? We are American citizens. We believe for sure that in the balance, the United States is a wonderful country with all of its flaws. And I would say the same thing to you about Israel. Recognize the flaws, admit some of the flaws, but remember that this is a country. It is the only democratic country in the Middle East. And it is a country that repeatedly has tried to seek peace and has been rejected by a fundamentalist antipathy to the very existence of the state of Israel.
Thank you, Dr. Berk. Now, I'm going to ask a question, and then I'll get back to the chat. It's been my opinion for a long time that if the rest of the Arab states, and we've seen some of the Gulf Arab states finally come to terms with Israel, and it's been my opinion that if enough Arab states establish diplomatic relations with Israel, this is going to put the Palestinians in an untenable position, and they will finally see that they have no place to go but to make peace. And I think Saudi Arabia may be the key to that, and I believe that's coming. What's your opinion of that?
That's the new theory. That's the new theory. The old theory was proven wrong when John Kerry used to say all the time, there'll never be peace between Israel and the Arab states unless Israel makes peace with the Palestinians. Well, Israel did not make peace with the Palestinians, and Israel got what you were talking about, the so-called Abraham Accords. But I must tell you, again with burning sorrow, those accords hang by a thread. The longer this conflict goes on, the Arab governments that signed peace agreements with Israel, they're going to confront a growing discontent on the so-called Arab street. In Saudi Arabia, in Egypt, particularly in Jordan, where 60% of the population is Palestinian. In that area, there will be so much discontent, so much rioting if this goes on, that those Arab governments who participate in the Abraham Accords may in fact withdraw and nullify the peace agreements that they have with Israel. I'm not making a prediction here. I'm telling you that, however, as long as this goes on, the possibility of an eruption on the Arab street is so great that we do not know what the political consequences will be.
All right.
How long can General Assisi maintain what is in effect a dictatorial control of Egypt? In the only free election in Egyptian history, the Muslim Brotherhood and parties to the right of the Muslim Brotherhood gained a majority, a large majority in the Egyptian parliament. How long can he hold on? Even without what's happening now, how long can he hold on? And given what is happening now, how long will the Arab street in Cairo and Alexandria and in other Egyptian cities, how long will it remain quiet? That's what I'm worried about. I'm not saying it will happen, but that's the great danger.
Thank you. From the chat, and then I'm going to ask people to raise their hands. From the chat, what is the ICC looking for in this conflict?
The ICC, the International Criminal Court, is being pressed by the large numbers of Arab states to find fault in Israel and to indict Israel for war crimes. And of course, remember, the ultimate crime that Israel will be accused of is the crime of apartheid. That is, making Israel analogous to old South Africa. That is worse than accusing the Israelis of war crimes, because our apartheid is a delegitimizing factor. If you can convince people that Israel is an apartheid state, which it is not an apartheid state, despite what that idiot Jimmy Carter said in that book about Israel being an apartheid state. But if you can convince people that Israel is an apartheid state, then you go a long way to saying that Israel does not have the right to exist. That's what the criminal court wants to do. The ICC wants to indict Israel. Now, let me say to you, why do I have problems with the ICC? Do you realize what's happening now in the rest of the world? Again, please forgive me, I'm not being condescending here. Again, I'll go to the New York Times. In this case, a very interesting story. It turns out that Muslim women in China are being forced to take or to really accept contraceptive devices. They're forced to do this. They will go to prison if they don't do this. Where is the ICC on that? It doesn't have the guts to take on the Chinese government, but it can take on Israel. And this is what about the Chinese in Tibet? What about the Russians in Chechnya? What about the Turks in dealing with Turkish Kurds? Is Israel alone the only flagrant violator of morality and international law? The answer is no. First of all, it's not a flagrant violator of morality and international law. The countries that I talked about are indeed in violation of international law and in violation of all standards of morality. And yet the ICC won't touch them. So I have nothing but contempt for the ICC.
Okay. So I'm going to come back to the chat in a moment. I'd like to see if anyone wants to raise their hand to ask a question. I don't see anybody. Oh, wait a minute. Go ahead. Mike Krasnow, go ahead. Unmute yourself.
Dr. Berk, thank you very much. My question is, the current rioting in Jerusalem, was that in any way related to Hamas starting to fire rockets?
The answer, of course, is yes. Hamas fired rockets. Ostensibly, Hamas fired rockets in support of the Arabs in Jerusalem. And of course, again, ostensibly saying that the Israelis were going to destroy the Al-Aqsa Mosque and we are firing rockets. But I tried to say in my talk that the real reason is it's a political reason for Hamas. Once again, forgive me for being redundant. Once again, Hamas launches rockets against Israel to deflect opposition away from itself in Gaza, and also, probably most important of all, to establish the credibility of Hamas vis-a-vis Hamas and Fatah and other Arab or Palestinian organizations. Again, forgive my crudeness. I actually was crude before. I'll be crude again. Hamas is demonstrating. We've got the balls. We're the macho men here among the Arabs. Where is Abbas, an 85-year-old man? Why isn't he leading the struggle? We're shooting the rockets. We're taking the hits from the Israelis. That's what Hamas is doing. But again, that the Hamas begins the escalation, and that is during and after the riots in Jerusalem.
All right. Thank you. So from the chat, please expand on the situation with the settlers and the Palestinians who feel they are going to be driven out of their homes.
There are, again, Israeli settlers on the West Bank. If it were me and I were an Israeli, in the aftermath of the Six-Day War, I would not have settled on the West Bank. I am a two-state person. I believe there should be a Palestinian state living side by side with an Israeli state. But I don't believe in political suicide. I don't believe that a Palestinian state that is hell-bent on destroying the state of Israel, I don't believe that Israel should facilitate the creation of a hostile Palestinian state. And again, are the settlers, some of them obnoxious? The answer is yes. I won't deny that. And again, I'm a two-state person. If it were me, if I were the prime minister of Israel, I would evacuate most of the Israeli settlements on the West Bank. But I try to tell you that it doesn't make a damn bit of difference. For Hamas and Islamic Jihad, one thing you've got to say for them, they're more honest than Arafat. Arafat used to talk about making peace with Israel and so on, and then probably played a role in fomenting the Second Intifada. Islamic Jihad and Hamas are very clear. Israel does not have the right to exist. Again, for the third time, if Israel withdrew from every settlement on the West Bank, it wouldn't make any difference. Where it would make a difference, it would enhance Israel's public image. That it would. I'll concede that point. Then Israel would look, well, we have no quarrel and so on. We're not oppressing anybody. We're not taking anybody's land. Yes, Israel's position would be enhanced. Its image would be much more likable on the international scene and among some left-wing American Jews. That's for sure. But would it have made a real difference in the way Hamas and Islamic Jihad look at the state of Israel. I'll bet you the Brooklyn Bridge, it wouldn't make a damn bit of difference. I take people at their word. Hamas says, and it says it's more honest than Arafat was. Hamas says Israel has to be destroyed. I'm not making that up. It's in the charter of their covenant. They say it all the time. And so people in the Islamic world will get the message. It uses a hadith. The hadiths are the sayings, the alleged sayings of the Prophet Muhammad. Whether he said all of them, even Muslim scholars debate whether he said all of them. But the most famous of them in the modern period is the one that runs something like this. There will be a day of judgment. On Judgment Day, the hadith says, on Judgment Day, the Muslim, the tree will say to the Muslim on Judgment Day, Muslim, there's a Jew hiding behind me, kill him. On Judgment Day, the hadiths will say, the rock, the stone will say to the Muslim, Muslim, there's a Jew hiding behind me, kill him. That's not moderate language. So you are right. If you are, no, you're not implying, you're saying that the Israeli settlements on the West Bank are provocative. I believe that. I do. As I said, if I were the Israeli prime minister, I would be a centrist, and I would believe that Israel should withdraw from most of the settlements. But again, I'm saying to you, it wouldn't make a damn bit of difference. Take people at their word. Look, I look at the audience here. You're mature people, not like the aardvarks that I teach. You're real people. You've been around the pool. Some of you are older than I am. Do you realize now that those of us who are old enough lived through a time when a man said, my aim is to eliminate the Jewish people from the face of the earth? Adolf Hitler said that, and he almost did it. If Hitler came in to this talk, his spirit somehow floated in, and I asked him, Mein Führer, if I asked him, what do you think is the major accomplishment of the Third Reich, of your government? You know what his answer would be? I made Europe Judenrein. I made Europe clean of Jews. You know what? After that, when somebody says to you, we're going to kill them all, we're going to destroy the state of Israel, and uses elegant language, we're going to create a Palestinian state between the river and the sea, that is genocide. You don't have to be a wizard of geography to understand that a Palestinian state between the river and the sea, there's no room for Israel.
All right. So your answer, I believe, perfectly dovetails with this question from the chat. How could Israel be so naive to believe that they would have peace with Arab states, knowing there will always be war with Hamas? How could they trust the Arab states? Whoever just unmuted, please mute yourself. Go ahead, Dr. Berk. Do you want me to repeat the question?
I'm muted. All right, now I'm unmuted.
I'm sorry. Oh, did I accidentally mute you? I'm so sorry. Okay. Do you want me to repeat the question?
No, I know what the question is. It's
Okay.
not naivete. It's a natural desire to end conflict so that your children and grandchildren can live in peace. In 1968, together with the Jewish Federation of Schenectady and Albany, we participated. I helped invite Moshe Dayan to come to speak at Union College, in the building really right behind me, actually. That's the Knott Memorial. It was such a large crowd that they moved to Memorial Chapel. And this is less than a year after the Six-Day War. And everybody is excited. Here's the great hero of 1967. And they expect a blood and guts speech. We whipped their asses and so on. He didn't say that. He said, to the surprise of everybody, you cannot have a country where half of the male population fights in the army and the other half of the male population supports those in one way or another, the other half that is fighting. You can't have a country that's in perpetual war. You can't do it. The Israelis understand that. They understand the prices that they have paid. There are 20,000 dead Israelis who have died in war. Another 3,500 have died as a result of terrorist attacks. You can't have a situation like that indefinitely. Yeah, unfortunately, it is becoming an indefinite resolution. The Israelis are not naive. I don't think it's naivete. It's simply a desire for peace. They want an end. You talk to people, you read the literature. It's very sad from people who fought in 1948. And when they are asked afterwards, you suffered a lot. The Israeli casualties were very, very high. And you hear, and now some of them are, those who haven't passed away, they're older people, and they say, we really believed that that would be the last war. The idea that our children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren would still be engaged in conflict with the Arabs, inconceivable to them. That's what they confront. It's not naivete. It's the natural desire of a peaceful people to have peace.
That's a perfect answer, I believe. I'm looking for hands. Somebody want to raise a hand? Up, I see. Who's that under? Oh, okay. The Zatzes have a question. Unmute yourselves.
I have a question. If you look at Hamas, how dependent is it on the guns and butter that come from from Iran?
You mean from Iran? You are absolutely right. And I should have mentioned that in my talk. This is fitting testimony to the fact that Iran is a renegade state. Today, I believe either last night or this morning, one of the leaders of Hamas said, we have rockets galore, and we have those rockets because we have been supplied by Iran. Iran wants the destruction of the state of Israel. Now you may say, what is this guy Berk talking about? He's an extremist. He's drawing the worst possible scenario. The last time I spoke to you during the wintertime, I think I said to you that there's a digital clock in Tehran that counts down minute by minute from 2040, because repeated governments of Iran have said sometime between now and 2040, Israel will be destroyed. Iran is trying to destroy the state of Israel, which raises all sorts of questions, which I'm surprised no one asked me about. And that is President Biden going on the right track? I oppose the deal. I spoke publicly against the deal. I thought it was a bad deal. Again, I'm not a Trumper. I didn't vote for President Trump. Yet, I think he was right. On that issue, he was absolutely right. I will also tell you, again, is President Biden going down the same road as before when he was vice president under Obama? I don't know. What I don't understand is we have leverage over Iran by the economic sanctions. How many of those sanctions on Iran is President Biden willing to jettison, to abandon? If we abandon all of those sanctions, how can we get a better deal? To go back to the old deal with its deficiencies. And what were its deficiencies? One, all of the sites in Iran were not to be scrutinized. The International Atomic Energy Agency was not allowed to go to some places. That was not good. The Iranians built ballistic missiles. That wasn't included in the deal either. To go back to the original deal is not a particularly good thing. But if you give up all the leverage that you have, how do you get them to negotiate an amendment to the deal? And then, if I haven't upset you enough, let me deal with this. Again, I only say this because I want you to know where I'm coming from. And I said this to you last winter. If you haven't picked up my accent, I'm from the Golden Land. I'm from Brooklyn. In Brooklyn, you get that gene on chromosome 16. that codes for the Democratic Party. Very hard. Maybe in Florida, the gene gets a mutation. But otherwise, for most of us who come from Brooklyn, the hand withers as you try to push down on the Republican lever. You can't do it. And yet, I'm telling you, I'm very concerned. As a registered Democrat who has voted Democratic nearly all of my life, since the time I began to vote, the Democratic Party scares me. The left wing of the Democratic Party presents a problem. Look at AOC today, condemning Israel. Look at Ilhan Omar, talking about Israel. This is proof that Israel is an apartheid state. Look at Rashid Tlaib. Look at that Democratic senator from Maryland, Chris Van Hollen. That's a problem for us. And I don't know if the grand old men and the grand old women of the Democratic Party either have the guts or the tenacity to stop that left wing of the party. It's a different world from what you and I grew up with. It's a different Democratic Party.
You're not kidding.
That's a matter of concern for me and for any supporter of the state of Israel. It should be a matter of concern for you.
I agree. I see Mark Ballo has your hand up. Mark, do you want to unmute?
Yeah, I want to go back to when Israel handed over Gaza. And I know it's easy to be a Monday morning quarterback, but would it have been different today if we didn't hand over Gaza as far as Hamas rising to power? Maybe you could review that whole scenario about how that happened, Israel just giving up on Gaza and abandoning Gaza to the Palestinians.
Another good question. All the questions have been very, very good, and it's a privilege for me to speak to you. I can't give you a definitive answer here. The Israelis were paying a blood price for staying in Gaza and for the settlements in the Sinai. They're paying a blood price for it. Not only a blood price, but an emotional and moral price. You look at you listen to Israeli soldiers. Now they're much older because Israel's out of Gaza a long time. It was very painful for them to be an occupying force in Gaza. They had to kill people. They were fired at. And from the Gaza Strip came attackers on settlements, Israeli settlements in the vicinity of Gaza. Did Israel make the right decision in leaving Gaza? You know, that's something the Israelis have to wrestle with. As far as leaving the Sinai is concerned, you can make a case for that. Israel should not have left the Sinai. But that's Menachem Begin's great decision. Menachem Begin made two great decisions. One, the bombing of the Iraqi nuclear reactor at Osirak in 1981. And before that, surrendering the Sinai for the sake of peace with Egypt. It was the correct call. Because no matter how cold that peace is, and God willing that peace will last for a while, peace with Egypt is not chopped liver. That's really very, very important. And again, I think I may have said something like this to you the last time we met. Begin understood it. And Begin, who really was very articulate in a number of languages, Begin came to the United States, and you know what he told the American Jews, as he told Israelis? This is not peace between Egypt and Israel. This peace is between Mitzrayim and Yisrael, evoking the ancient antipathy, the ancient conflict between Egypt and Israel. To get peace between Egypt and Israel, if it meant surrendering the Sinai and Sharm el-Sheikh, Begin was prepared to do it. And I think his history will judge him correct. As far as Gaza is concerned, the Egyptians didn't want it. The Israelis didn't want it. So they left it on its own. And they have paid a price for that. Did they have options? Well, we can talk about that till we're blue in the face. Only history will judge the correctness or the incorrectness of that decision.
All right, thank you. There's one identified just as David. You had your hand up. Would you like to unmute and ask your question?
Oh, I didn't. My question was, what is behind the press not going deep enough in telling the facts, i.e., with the people, the Palestinians who may be dislocated, the fact that they haven't been paying rent for a number of years? So what is behind the press not going far enough back to tell a story?
Another good question, and I must tell you, you're asking the most difficult question that a historian has to confront. I tell you, as a preface, my students accuse me of a multitude of sins. Waffling is never one of them. Nonetheless, I will tell you, the most difficult thing that a historian has to deal with is motivation. Why do people do the things? Why do they think the things that they do? Why do they do the things that they do? I can't answer your question. Is it a liberal bias? Is it a bias for a perceived underdog? Is Israel seen to be too powerful? Is it anti-Semitism? I think all of these things come into play. Yes, I tried to say in the talk that land dispute is a very complex one. Very, very complex. It's land that was owned by Israelis, then taken away after the 48 war, then recovered again in 1967, and then the descendants of those who owned the land originally now claim the land, but now there are Arabs living on the land as squatters for 20, 30, 40 years. Who's right? I can't answer that. But you are absolutely right when you say that the press has portrayed this as an Israeli eviction, as an act of Israeli immorality. It's a legal issue. And I tried to say again in the talk, that legal issue is exacerbated by Hamas and by Abbas talking about, again, moving from that to argue that the Israelis want to destroy everything that's Arab in Jerusalem, expel the Arabs of Jerusalem, and so on.
Okay, so I think we have time for one more question. Do I see a hand anywhere?
I'll take any question. I'll stay as long as you want.
Oh, okay. All right. Then in that case, do I see a hand anywhere? Anybody? Anybody?
Remember that old adage.
Let me look at page 2. Now there are a lot of blank screens. So if you've got your hand up and I'm not calling on you, it's because I can't see you. Just unmute and ask your question.
All right. One of the oldest adages, that's a redundancy.
Sorry. Did I cut you off? I'm sorry.
Oldest adages, in war, the first casualty is the truth. And that's important. That's what's happening now. But you are right. Whoever asked the question, you're absolutely right. They should probe deeper. But they don't want to probe deeper because of an a priori sympathy for a group of people that they perceive to be underdogs. Israel is no longer the David facing Goliath. Israel is the Goliath facing the poor, oppressed, and weak Palestinians. That's the way it is perceived.
Okay. I may have accidentally cut you off. I apologize. Anyone wants to unmute and ask a question? Once more, does anyone want to unmute and ask a question? Otherwise, going once, going twice. Dr. Berk, once again, we thank you for another amazing presentation. We knew it would be great. It was. And thank you, everyone, for coming tonight. We hope you will tune into some of the upcoming programs. Everyone stay safe, stay well.
Bye-bye. Stay well and stay safe. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
So long, Dr. Berk.
So long.
Thank you again.
Shalom uvracha.